Hello and welcome everyone. We're so excited to have you all here to join us for the IYNA's August Neuro and webinar Neuro and Comics. We're thrilled to introduce our guest speaker for today's webinar, Dr. Matteo Farinella.
Dr. Matteo Farinella is a neuroscientist, illustrator, and science communicator at Columbia University's Zuckerman Institute, where he creates comics, animations, and other visual media to make neuroscience more accessible. His work combines scientific insights with artistic creativity to make complex ideas easier to understand and more engaging for diverse audiences.
All right, and I think from here we'll hand it off to you, Dr. Farinella, if you want to tell us more about your career journey and experiences.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here on a Saturday morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. I'm impressed. You really you are committed to neuroscience. Let me try to share my screen. All right. You see my presentation?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So yeah, it's a pleasure to be here with you all. I'm Matteo Farinella, as you know, and I'm gonna tell you a bit more about what I'm doing now, how I got here, and yeah, I'm gonna leave plenty of time at the end for questions. But I already read some of the questions, so I'm gonna try to answer as much as possible during the talk. And yeah, this is maybe a bit different from other career talks. I mean, I saw you at last month already a talk about scientific communication. So if you've seen that one with Ali Caldwell, like I'm very much working in the same space, but from a different angle, much more visual angle. So I'm currently working as scientific multimedia producer at Columbia University Zuckerman Institute, which I illustrated here. Oh, by the way, I'm going to show you a lot of pictures, and usually I always try to give credit. I think it's very important. If there is no credit, it usually means it's my own drawing. But so yeah, this is my creative take on the Zuckerman Institute. It's the standalone, the latest kind of standalone neuroscience institute at Columbia. We have many neuroscientists at Columbia, but this center was really created to bring together different approaches to neuroscience, different people from different departments, and also we have a lot of creativity going on. We have artists in residence, we have a lot of educational programs, and so it's a big institute, a big team, and we already have some of the best scientists in the world, and they already publish on the best peer-reviewed journals. Our job is to help them reach even further and engage with non-scientists and different audiences. So I say we because I'm part of the communication team. I don't work alone. We have a science writer. That's what you heard more from last month. We have a science filmmaker, audio producer, and then I'm kind of the latest addition. I do everything visual. So our job is to translate this very complex, very important science into something more engaging, some kind of stories that people can relate to. And this takes many different forms. So I do many different things in my work, as you're gonna see. I do from more traditional science diagrams, which you may be used to seeing in textbooks or papers. I don't do too many of these, but when scientists need help, I'm always happy to help them kind of summarize the research into one figure. Then kind of one step up, like more creative, is covers. I help them designing scientific covers. You can submit this to the journals, and of course, yeah, they also get a lot of traffic online. And then when we have more time, I also like to do animations. It's kind of one of the latest thing I learned to do. Animation take a lot of time. Again, I'm happy to talk more about the technical aspect later, but that's the main difference. Animations really require like months of work sometimes. So we usually try to do is on they're not necessarily tied to like a new breaking news paper, but more like kind of bigger topics that we can take more time with and really zoom out. And yeah, I mean, I love this job. It's really fun because I still get to read about the latest science, but it's very fast paced. It doesn't require me spending 3 or 4 years on one specific cell or one specific protein. I just get to learn the big picture and then translate it into something more fun and accessible. And how did I get here? Talking about the career part. So I started as a neuroscientist. I mean, even further back, I did my undergraduate was in cellular molecular biology. I studied in Italy, where I'm from. I did a degree in cellular molecular biology. Then I specialized. I did a master in neurobiology. And then I eventually moved to the UK, to London, to do a Ph.D. in neuroscience. And the topic of my Ph.D. was computational neuroscience. So it was not even not a particularly visual or creative part of neuroscience. And yeah, I don't quite know why I chose that. I mean, and again, I'm happy to talk more about that if you want, kind of the pros and cons. But throughout my life, throughout my career, I always had this parallel passion for comics. I grew up reading comics, like I think most of you did, but I also love to draw and to tell story, and I just started drawing my own comics, which maybe is more unusual. But yeah, I always cultivated this thing. Also, it helps that, as I said, I mentioned, I'm from Italy. There's a big comic culture, a bit like France. Like comics are kind of everywhere. They're considered now officially like an art form. And so, yeah, I put Superman here, but I actually never read superheroes. I read more like what today are called graphic novels. So, and yeah, there's a big kind of self-publishing scene in Bologna. So I slowly started making my own comics. So I took it seriously, but I never took it serious as a career because I never really saw any way to combine science and comics. I thought these were just like kind of two opposite worlds. So for many years, I kept the two very, very separate. I was trying to be a good science student during the day, reading my papers, writing my code, and then I was doing my comics in my evenings, weekends. And I wasn't exactly like hiding my passion for comics from my colleagues, from my lab, but yeah, it's not something I was like volunteering or something I was particularly proud of. It felt a bit like a waste of time, an indulgence which I should probably give up at some point. And also because, again, I want to make clear, the comics I was doing at the time, they were not about science. I don't usually show this. This is kind of like a deep cut. My early comics. My comics were the kind of comics I was reading. They were like these like very dark comedy or like autobiographic comics. It was like my first trip to New York actually, or like again graphic novels. Started to be a bit more scientific, but it was, yeah, again, I was not trying to explain the science. I was really trying to I was just drawing about things I cared about, and I was putting all this stuff online, but I never really pursued it until toward the end of my PhD. Literally, I think it was like the last year and a half of my PhD. I met a new colleague, Hannah Ross, who joined our lab as a postdoc. So she was a more senior scientist. But she also had a background in science communication. Particularly, she was making science documentaries. So she had unlike other scientists, she had this understanding that visual and storytelling could be really useful when talking about science. So she was the first one from my academic world that really encouraged me to use the skill I had. And she didn't just see it as a waste of time, but she said, no, we should use this. We should make a comic about the brain. This is amazing. And I always give Hannah a lot of credit because at the beginning I was very skeptic. As I said, like, I mean, I thought it would be something fun for me to do, but I just never saw it done. I didn't think it was a thing. I didn't know if anybody would read this comic. But Hannah really persisted. And yeah, through, like chatting in the lab, during lunch breaks, she eventually convinced me to do this book together called Neurocomic, not very originally. And we got also support. We wrote a grant. We got support from the Wellcome Trust, which, if you don't know them, I also always happy to talk about them because they are this big foundation in the UK. They support a lot of basic research, like they actually fund science, but they also care about science communication. So they had this, I don't know if they still do, but they had a lot of small grants for innovative, original science communication projects. So we got this grant to make this book, and I will never know exactly what caught their attention, but I think something we made clear from the very beginning was that this book was not meant as a textbook in comic format. So we didn't just want to like explain neuroscience in a didactic way. We wanted to tell a story. This is something you're gonna hear me over and coming back over and over, this power of storytelling. So from the very early sketches, we say like we're gonna have a character that gets physically transported inside the brain. And the character is not a scientist. It's just this random guy who finds himself lost and confused in what looks this like other world, this forest. Then we will eventually learn that what look like trees are actually brain cells, neurons, and this forest is a brain. And he goes to all kind of adventures and meets famous scientists and other weird creatures. So you can see it's very action driven. It's not what you expect from a science book. And yeah, whatever the reason, whether it's the storytelling aspect or the beautiful cover that a publisher then helped us put together, which was very much inspired by, like old science books, back when science books were well designed and fun. And yeah, this comic was published in 2013, which was also the end, the last year of my PhD. I graduated in July 2013, and the book came out in September. And without being modest, like the book was like went way beyond our expectations. It got a lot of press. It is now translated in over 10 languages all around the world. So clearly there was an audience for this, a way bigger audience than we anticipated. So this kind of like, my career is kind of unusual because there's like this single moment where I really like, I switched. Like up until then, I knew I didn't want I knew I didn't want to stay in research necessarily. Like I knew I wasn't a good scientist, for lack of a better term. Like I loved learning about science, but I didn't really like doing the science, the experiments. So I was already thinking about to work in something more related to communication or writing, but it's not something I ever thought I could do because, again, I'm not a native speaker, so writing never really came that natural to me. And so yeah, I didn't have a clear plan, but suddenly the success of Neurocomic kind of opened a new door. So after my PhD, I left research. So I'm not a researcher anymore. I think maybe some people like still think I do both the science and the communication. I do most of the communication now, the illustration. And yeah, I went freelance from 2013 to 2016. I and again, I don't usually talk too much about these years, but since this is about career, I want to like go a bit more in depth because it's not easy. Like it really took a leap of faith. Like I had one successful book, but that doesn't guarantee anything. It doesn't pay the rent. I was very privileged that like I studied in Italy where education is essentially free. So I had no debts. I had some money saved from my PhD. And so this was my chance to say, like, there's this thing that art that I never really took seriously, but this is my chance to try. Like I'm gonna give it everything I have and see if it works out. And slowly, very slowly, but it did work out. One of my first client was actually this class, which I just realized like starting today, and it's really like I think it would be perfect for many of you if you're interested in doing neuroscience. I think it's still all free. It's part of this edX program. It's like online classes. This is a class all about neuroscience produced by Harvard X. And this was back in 2014, but it's still going. I think they still do it every year. And, most of the classes are honestly pretty boring. It's just like a professor talking in the camera about whatever they're studying. But this one, maybe because it was Harvard, was very well produced. They had an amazing producer that hired plenty of illustrators and animators. And so she found me through the comic, and she told me like, you are perfect. Like we need illustrators for this like very technical course about neuroscience. So they started using some of my drawings. I think from the very first lecture, you can see some of my drawings. And then, yeah, they commissioned me more things. They did a whole Kickstarter because they partnered with this company called Backyard Brains, which could also be very interesting to you. They're basically trying to make neuroscience experiment more accessible because, as you know, studying the brain is hard, but you don't need an fMRI. You can do very simple experiments with insects, for example, or plants, or even like with your own muscle, like picking up electric signals. So anyway, they did a whole Kickstarter to send this little neuroscience DIY kit to the students. And I drew a poster for that. And then Backyard Brain became one of my main clients. I've been working for them since then. So these are the little kits they sell, these spiker boxes. I also did some workshops. I got to try them. They're not easy, but they're kind of fun. And of course, they give you plenty of like guidance, experiments, how to do it. They just published a book for which as you see, I did the cover. I did a lot of insider illustrations. And so again, these were like my ideal clients. They were people that really focus on neuroscience, but they were also trying to make it fun and engaging. And they really embrace my style, like especially Backyard Brain. Like all they want from me is like to do this like black and white drawing as I used to do. Now, as you will see, I do other things too, but yeah, so those two clients really helped me, like gave me a lot of confidence. And then again, it's always a connection, right? Then the producer who hired me for Harvard X started a new magazine called Massive Science, which unfortunately no longer exists, but they publish a lot of great stuff. They publish a lot of science writing, they train science writers, and then we started collaborating on this series of portraits celebrating famous women in science, which are often underlooked in history. So I started making this whole series of cards, and again, people really liked them. And so Massive Science was like, oh, they look a bit like cards. Let's make a tarot deck all about science, women of science. So there's another kind of self-started project, this crowdfunded project, which I had a lot of fun doing. And also in the meanwhile, I was doing more books. I did children books, always about the brain. These are published mostly in Europe for now. This is the first one. And as you can see, like, I mean, it starts a bit more science books, but like in Neurocomic, I really leaned in the storytelling aspect. So it's the story of a young neuron, Ramon, who has to decide what to do when he grows up. So he goes on a sort of school trip around different neighbors of the brain, and he sees the different jobs that neurons do. So he can see like the motor cortex, the amygdala, the emotional center of the brain. And yeah, so all the science is presented in this very, very simple, character-driven format. And then I also did another book for adults, more like Neurocomic, called The Senses. And again, I don't want to spend too much time on this. It's like I think by now you get the idea of what I was trying to do. Yeah, I also have some, like, you can see the process. Like these are the starting sketches, which look much more like scientific diagrams. And then I do a storyboard, then the final. And, I really love doing this. It's still my favorite format. But also, talking about career, making books take a lot of time, like years. And you don't really, like, you get paid only if the book goes well. So it's kind of a gamble and not a very sustainable one. So after doing this for a few years, I started kind of think more broadly, like, what do I want to do? Like, what? Also, like, really, I was thinking, like, why I'm doing what I'm doing. Like, I mean, I enjoy drawing comics, and people seem to enjoy this, but what are comics actually doing for science? Like, what can they offer to science? And maybe because I have this academic background, like, I really wanted to dive deeper into this. So I briefly returned to research, but not really neuroscience research. I was part of this amazing program called Presidential Scholars in Society and Neuroscience, where people were really encouraged to combine different disciplines. So in my case, combine my neuroscience background with my art communication background. And so I spent 3 years, that's how I ended up at Columbia University, where I'm now. I spent 3 years really, like, trying to answer this question. And I'm gonna try to keep it brief, but I want to give you some of the highlights of what I found, because I think it really, like, kind of give me a better understanding of what I'm doing. And so if you want to read more about this, I did publish some peer-reviewed articles. Well, mostly this one, more like technical, with like a review of experiments and like studies using comics and communication. There's also more kind of reader-friendly version published by American scientists. But the things I'm trying to always getting back to is these three components: visual thinking, storytelling, and metaphor. And I think whatever you end up doing, whether it's research or whether you're going to be a doctor or whether you want to go more into the arts, communications, I really think these three elements can be really useful to you. So just briefly, like, visual thinking is this concept that drawing and visuals really help us think. It's not so beyond communication, beyond making things simpler, which is how I think visuals are usually perceived. Drawing and thinking visually can really help you even as a scientist. Temple Grandin, who's a famous engineer and neurodiversity advocate, wrote this old book about visual thinking, where she really argues there are two fundamental ways. There's the linear thinking, which is the one that associated with writing, and is also very often reinforced in school. Like I think we all start by drawing, right? But then at a certain point in school, they tell us, no, drawing is just for fun. The way you think, the way you express yourself is writing. Which there's nothing wrong with writing, but writing is very linear. It's very good at putting things in order, right? And it's always like the way we are tested is also there was like the right answer. And visual thinking, she argues, is more expansive. It's more about making connections and seeing things from different perspectives, which is also very important in science, especially when you're like in the part where you put the pieces together and you make up new theories. And I think comics are great because they can be both linear, so that you can read them like text, one panel at a time, but you can also see them all at once. And in that sense, they send like another message that is not in the individual panels. And also, you can start a bit playful, and you can start to look at things from different angles with visuals. Also, again, this idea of panels, it really helps to break down information in easier steps. When you're reading a paragraph of text, it's like everything has the same weight. But if you break it down into panels, then you can, it becomes like a diagram, right? Like a step-by-step diagram. And then you can play with the size of the panels and convey duration. And the most beautiful thing about comics is that they are static, so you can spend as much time as you want on each panel. So somebody can read this very fast or can really spend a long time studying it. And educators like Gene Young argues that this permanency of comics allows different readers to read at different speeds. Unlike animation, for example, I saw some question about animations, and I love animations. I think they can be great, but animation can be really fast, and it makes it hard to like unless you're absorbing the information at the same speed, then you have to pause, you have to rewind, it's a bit harder. A comic page is always there, so you can easily go back and forth, read as many times as you want, already very fast, which is also why most people can read a comic in one day, unlike a traditional textbook. So yeah, again, I think the visual can really help people think through different topics. Another important element of comics, which I already mentioned, is storytelling. And storytelling, again, this goes beyond comics. Even if you go into science writing or anything you do, like when you're writing a grant proposal, when you're giving a talk, that's what you're trying to do. You're telling a story. And there's a lot of research about stories, and most famously, Joseph Campbell pointed out there are like there's like a sequence that is pretty universal across cultures that traditional stories tend to follow. This is an illustration I made for Scientific American for a graphic, an article about storytelling. So there is something very pleasing about stories. People prefer to read stories than explanatory articles. They are more engaging, they're easy to remember. And so when it comes to science, I think it's very important to tell stories. And you can do it in different ways. You can tell personal stories of the scientists themselves. And this is something I've been doing a lot, actually, as part of my job. We have this series called The Science Life, which is they're very simple, very short, like 6-panel stories, comic strips about how people got into neuroscience. So this is actually something else you may want to check out if you're thinking of going to this field. We have now more than 40 stories. They're all from our institute, of course, but I think they give you a real sense of the diversity and the breadth of like different people have different motivations. Some people went in because they have family stories. Some people like really like working with tools, and they end up doing different kind of science also. So they took different paths. So yeah, this is really meant for like people like you, kind of like thinking about this career, but not quite sure how people get there. And they really focus also, one reason we did this is because I feel like in science, we often focus on the professor, like the famous professor that win the prize and make the big discovery. But what about all the undergraduates or the grad students or the lab technicians, all the other people that work in the lab, and they often don't get covered, in like, major newspapers. So we are trying to shed lights on all these hidden stories. The big problem with storytelling is that, again, unless you're focusing on the people themselves, it's hard to find a story. And science really like pushes us to like think about the very, very small or the very, very big, both in space and time. And there it becomes harder to find stories because there are no human characters. But I think this is where comics have another magic trick, which is they can make characters out of everything. You can just add the face and arms on on a cell, and it becomes a character. And I know this may seem silly, and it means definitely like for a specific audience. So I use it mostly when I'm talking to younger audiences, but I think it's very powerful because again, it turns these very abstract concepts like a neuron into something more relatable that even a child can read about. Another slightly different things you can do is to bring the humans down to the scale of science. This is something, yeah, I use these covers for Madmaster as an example. And yeah, these are not full comics, but yeah, you could imagine a full comic, right? You can imagine the story of a doctor like shrink down to the level of a microbe, and then the whole science becomes more like an adventure. And I think it gives it this more like embodied, intuitive understanding of even like how big is a virus compared to a cell. Like these are all very abstract things until you get down to that scale. Okay, the last thing I want to mention, which I could spend an hour talking just about this, but yeah, metaphor is something I feel like we don't often think about in science, but they are very, very important. I'm saying we in terms of like research scientists, like I never had anybody explaining in metaphors when I was an undergrad. There are of course many philosophers and historians and linguists that wrote entire books about this. And the main consensus is that metaphors really help us, like drawing, they help us think, especially when we are studying things that we cannot see, we cannot touch, like classic example is electricity. The first time people studied the subject, they used metaphors, especially visual metaphors, to help, literally to help us see these things that we couldn't otherwise perceive. And some of these metaphors become really central to scientific theories. So it's not just for fun, it's not just for communicating to the lay audience. They're useful for the scientists themselves. Another example I always use for this is the idea of the brain as a forest, which is not new. I did not make it up. It was actually introduced by what's considered the father of modern neuroscientists, this Spanish anatomist, Santiago Ramon y Cajal, who later won the Nobel Prize for his research on brain cells. He was the first one to essentially look at brain cells under the microscope and understand their structure, how they're connected. He was also an amazing artist. As you can see, he made these beautiful drawings of cells. And that's why he's one of the first characters in Neurocomic. He's kind of one of my idols. But also, yeah, as I was saying, you use this metaphor of these neurons as trees. And the old jargon we use today is like, if you study neuroscience, you're gonna hear about branches and arborizations and spines. These are all the technical terms which we don't even think as metaphors anymore, but they were all built around this metaphor. He also said beautiful things like the brain is like a garden that you need to tend, like it changes over time and you can shape over time with experience. So okay, metaphors are great. And yeah, we often use them when we try to explain something. The brain has always been compared to the latest technology. Today, we almost take it for granted. The brain is like a computer, which is not. It's not a computer. It works similar to a computer, but people compare it to clockworks, to looms, to telegraphs, basically anything that was the latest communication technology. And yeah, I'm not saying there is one better than the other, but I always invite scientists to think more carefully, because I think we often take this for granted or use the first metaphor that comes to mind because we're used to it. But the kind of metaphor you choose really sends a different message and has certain implications. So I'm especially careful now with technological metaphors of the brain. I much prefer the tree or the forest metaphor. And finally, metaphors, if you're doing drawings or comics, they can become a whole setting. So you can see in this story I'm working on it, the brain becomes a city. I mean, the nervous system becomes a city with the brain as the center, and all the nerves connecting different parts of the body. So again, to recap, these are the kind of three, if you want, the three tools, three techniques I come back to over and over in my work. But as I was saying, I think they can be useful in general because, yeah, storytelling and metaphor, definitely you could do it in writing, you can do it in videos, they can do it like in presentations. It's just something you need to be very careful about. And the main message, if you remember anything from today, I hope it's that there's not one type of science graphic. It's not like, and it's not enough to just be good at drawing. In fact, I would almost say, like, I mean, I enjoy drawing, but like the skill is something you can build, like you get better. But I think it's even more important to really be able to change your style and adapt your style to your audience. Because I repeat, this is not about making pretty figures, it's about really thinking, what is the message I'm trying to send? What do people need to learn from this visual? And that's why, as you can see now, like 10 years later, like I really work in very different styles. And yeah, I saw some question about process or my usual day, so I just want to quickly like give you an overview. There's no typical day, but the process I think is pretty much the same, whether my work at Columbia, my freelance work, my personal work. So I always start with the science, and I really try to learn as much as possible about the science, like before I even think about what to draw. So I was saying, like, drawing in a way is like secondary. It's really about understanding what I'm trying to convey here, what I'm trying to say. And I think it helps to be, many people also ask me, do you need to have a PhD in neuroscience to do what you do? And like, definitely not. I'm a very overqualified illustrator, but I think it helps, yeah, having some background and having at least a curiosity in what you're drawing about, because then it allows you to really like simplify and find more creative ways to visualize it. And then, yeah, the next step is always think about, like, who's this for? It's not for the scientist. The scientist already knows their research, and they think everything is important, of course, because they spent 5 years working on this paper, right? And it's not for me, it's not just for like making a pretty drawing or showing how much I can pack into a drawing. We are trying to reach somebody. And so, yeah, think like, what are their motivations to engage with this? Like, what are they interested in? What are their values? And that also should inform, for example, metaphors. Metaphors are very culturally dependent. So a metaphor that makes sense for people, maybe like children in the US, may not make sense in other places. And so, yeah, and then of course you go back and revise as long as possible. And I think it's usually about summarizing, like really selecting what information is important to include and what it may be important for the science is not important for the specific people we are talking to. Oh, and the last thing I always want to remind, I think it's important, we don't talk about it enough in science, that take breaks. I mean, my breaks look very similar to my work because I generally love drawing. So even if I have some free time, I have a sketchbook and I try to draw what's right in front of me. I'm very lucky, like since 2020, I work remotely from outside the city, up in the country, in the mountains. So, but yeah, wherever you are, like I feel like it's really important to, whatever you end up doing, just like slow down. And especially in science, honestly, like I think science is becoming so competitive and so like such a race to publish and get data. But the way science started was really like people paying attention, just like being able to slow down and notice things that other people wouldn't notice. And I'm afraid we are kind of losing that, the way we are training scientists. So I'm more and more convinced now, like I started using drawing as a tool for communication, but I'm now, like the more time passed, the more I think drawing is really a useful skill, both for the scientists to think, like to structure their understanding, and also just as a practice to, like, even if you don't become like a professional illustrator, just like observational drawing is really a good way to like slow down and focus your attention. So if you're interested in drawing, I want to encourage you, again, whatever you end up doing. I know it's hard to find the time, but I think it's really a useful skill, especially for scientists. Yeah, we can take some questions, but I want to, yeah, like if I can share the presentation, maybe like if you want more to know more about any of these things, I'm always happy to share some resources. These are great books about comics and visual thinking in general. There are many books about science graphics, which is, of course, an even broader field. And yeah, I give you a very narrow view of science graphics. Like there are people doing infographics, data visualizations. You can do many things. If you want to get started, I recommend this book by Jen Christensen, who's also the art director of Scientific American. And it's really intended for scientists. So it's really like, even if you're doing everything digitally or you're working with an illustrator, like this is kind of a step-by-step guide to help you think, what should your graphics look like? And finally, yeah, there are some associations. I'm not part of these, but if you want to see different people working in this space, I think they're good, a good place to start. There is the Association of Medical Illustration and Animation. There's the Guild of Natural Science Illustrators, which is more like, like anatomical, like animals or reconstructions of dinosaurs, that kind of stuff. There are also some interesting online groups like ECHOS, I think is mostly Europe-based, and this Biocreative Index, which is a very recent, a friend of mine just put together and really collects not just anything, anybody's trying to combine science and art. So also like designs, web design, interactives, or even like fine artists working on the intersection between biology and art. And finally, if you want to see more of my work, of course, you can check out my website. You can reach out to me. I'm honestly always happy to help people that want to get started in this field, because I know it's not easy. It's not easy to get started because it's not, let's be honest, there are not many people doing it. There's not like a recognized figure like science journalism. So yeah, you kind of have to make up your own career. And if you tell me what you're interested in specifically, maybe it's not something I do, but I can point you in the right direction. All right. And with that, I am done. I can stop sharing, and I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Farinella. It's absolutely incredible to hear more about your process in doing your work and also how you got started in this field. I think I echo a lot of the comments that were made during your talk, in that your illustrations are so beautifully done. And I think it's very inspiring to see how you're really growing the field of science communication with your illustrations. First off, I just want to thank Dr. Farinella for taking the time again to share with us your career insights and perspectives, creating this amazing discussion around illustration and neuroscience. And as always, stay tuned for more webinars in the future, and we hope to see you all soon. All right, thank you everyone so much again for joining us.